Broadway again. Over the next 8 years, he made guest appearances on variety shows and did some radio work and summer stock theater. He also went back to his old eating habits and ballooned accordingly. By 1958, Paul was in a deep depression and not working at all. He said he was contemplating suicide.
He talked about around that time that he was at this party with a bunch of his friends in New York, and he just stood up halfway through the party and said, you know, I haven't heard a word anyone said all night, and I just don't think it's fair to be doing this to you. And he left the party, and the very next day he decided he had to get some analysis.
Paul saw a psychiatrist for more than a year. He later claimed she saved his life. Paul's career also took a huge leap forward. In 1960, director Gower Champion hired him to play the father of a star-struck teenager in the new Broadway musical Bye Bye Birdie. Paul would play the same role in the successful movie version of the show 3 years later.
I demand respect around here.
It's my hair!
Respect, you hear? Respect!
I respect you, Papa.
I don't want your respect. Who wants respect from a 10-year-old kid?
The part was made for Paul Lynde. Nobody else played that guy. He played just kind of a common man who looked aghast at the world around him and couldn't deal with it. He just was totally helpless at all times and was very cranky about it.
Bye Bye Birdie became a huge hit on Broadway and established Paul as a major comic star.
It was so exciting, and he invited me to the premiere. And I had such a marvelous time. We walked into Sardi's afterwards, and everyone clapped for Paul. It was such a fine evening. I'll never forget it.
For the film, only Paul and Dick Van Dyke were hired from the original Broadway cast. But Paul was not at all pleased with the Hollywood version of Bye Bye Birdie. He said it should have been called Hello, Anne Margaret.
At the opening of the film, she comes out and she sings the title song, Bye Bye Birdie. And then at the tail end, they have her doing that again. So she's the last thing you remember when you go out of the theater. But that was not in the original cut of it at all. That was added later. So it became kind of an Anne Margaret movie, although everybody certainly did do well with it, including Paul. But I don't think Paul was quite the success in the movie that he had been on the stage, because part of that that salty humor that he had was diluted somewhat in the film.
But Paul had bigger problems on his hands during the filming of Bye Bye Birdie than Anne Margaret's high visibility. A longtime fondness for drinking was turning into full-fledged alcoholism.
One thing that we shared at the time, we talked about it many, many years later. In those days, particularly during the movie, which was about 1963 or 4, we were both sliding into alcohol addiction, and were not aware of it, as people seldom are when it's happening to them.
And Paul was beginning a self-destructive pattern of turning vicious when he got drunk.
There is a story that happened during Bye Bye Birdie that was only funny to me now. He wanted to meet Hal Prince, the Broadway producer. He idolized him, thought he was a genius. And a woman that we knew was having a party, and Hal Prince was coming, and he pleaded with her, please, let me come to your party so I can meet Hal Prince. So she did. And he met Hal Prince and immediately backed him against the wall and cut him to ribbons. I mean, just absolutely slashed him to pieces. He had gone over the hump there with his drinking and became his nasty self. Well, the next day he was beside himself. He said, oh, my idol, I love that man. I just tore him to pieces. So he called this woman and once again pleaded, please, I have got to make amends. You've got to let me make up to this man. So she did, had him back, and he did the same thing again. He did back him against the wall and slashed him. He couldn't help himself. It's too bad that Hal Prince did not have a sense of humor about it, and I understand that he didn't.
With the success of Bye Bye Birdie, Lynde decided to make a permanent move to Los Angeles. He was done with the theater world for now, and he was ready to see what Hollywood and television had to offer. By the time Paul Lynde was 36, he was well on his way to becoming a celebrity. His star turn in Bye Bye Birdie led to the recording of a comedy album and regular spots on shows like The Perry Como Show. Over the next few years, He appeared in minor roles in films like Under the Yum Yum Tree and Beach Blanket Bingo. His role in The Glass Bottom Boat was significant, if only because it was his first and only film appearance in drag.
May I have this dance? Officer, would you like?
I've been watching you all evening. You've been acting very suspiciously, especially around the buffet table. The buffet table. And you haven't taken a bite.
I do. Well, I'm trying to, you know.
It was a funny scene. I think it also illustrates, though, how limited Paul actually was as a performer, and one reason perhaps why he didn't do better films and wasn't embraced by better directors is because he did the same thing over and over again.
Lynde continued to make guest appearances on variety shows throughout the 60s. He also guest starred in many television series, both dramas and sitcoms, although his roles were always comedic, never serious.
People didn't want that. They wanted the comedy. I mean, that was his thing. And I think he could have done individual parts that were serious. He had that depth, but he didn't have the opportunity.
Instead, Paul was forging a lucrative career as a character actor, most notably on series like The Munsters, I Dream of Jeannie, and Bewitched. He was originally hired on Bewitched to play Samantha's driving instructor.
Would you like to join me in a cup of coffee?
Do you think we can both fit?
Ready?
Ready.
How am I doing?
How to phrase it tactfully. You are rotten.
Elizabeth Montgomery enjoyed Paul so much that the show created the regular role of Uncle Arthur for him.
My life has no meaning. I have loved and lost.
Oh, my stars.
A broken-hearted clown. Laugh, clown. No one knows your heart is broken. Even though you're only make-believing. Laugh, clown, laugh.
He was great in that because that was also a level that was good for him. I mean, it was not an important series. It was an entertaining series. It was very lightweight and all of that. And it was, again, something that he could kind of do, I think, with his eyes closed.
Director William Asher and his wife, Elizabeth Montgomery, became Paul's best friends, and he spent an enormous amount of time with them. But Paul still found it hard to be close to very many people. For the most part, he remained aloof.
His persona on camera and on stage was totally different. He actually was very introverted, very, very shy around people. He had a very close-knit group of friends, but that was about it.
And Paul's drinking problem was getting worse. After a few cocktails, that genial, funny guy that people saw on television lost all control and became very mean, sometimes violent.
I lived in an apartment building next to where he lived, and I remember one night there was this big kerfuffle in his apartment, this noise and crashing and sound, and the police were called. He'd had somebody over for dinner, and during the course of the dinner, they'd started breaking up the apartment, and so the police took them off to jail. So that was Paul. I mean, he was volatile and crazy always.